Thank you, Bunty and Boone, for the generous invitation to moderate this first extraordinary session. I would also like to thank Mr. Singh of the Ministry of Culture for suggesting that events like these should be more participatory and inclusive in the future, and it sort of answers in an indirect kind of way why else have a museum than to create participation and education in the future. So thank you for answering that, and I think we can all follow through with a certain amount of cognizance and vigilance with the passage of time. So thank you, Mr. Singh, for that. I also wanted to say that, yes, extraordinary moments like this are going to be archived with the passage of time, and that also creates a kind of interesting dissonance and future for what we think about archiving is, performance being part of it, and perhaps days like these will have a performative character as well. So I wanted us to think about that. I was also very keen to say that our diverse and esteemed panel here today is something that I come to you from a position of learning really about your viewpoints and practices. So really wanted to hear more about that. Mariles Gustilo is the Senior Director of Arts and Culture at the Ayala Foundation. She is concurrently Senior Director of the Ayala Museum, which includes both the museum and the Filipinas Heritage Library. Since joining the Ayala Museum in 2012, Gustilo has established renewed dynamism at the museum through astute programming to engage with audiences. Pip Laurenson is the head of collection care research at the Tate in the United Kingdom and professor of art, collection and care at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. She has over 20 years of experience in the conservation and contemporary art and thereby founding and leading one of the Tate's time-based media conservation sections between 1996 and 2010. In her current role, Laurenson develops and supports research related to the conservation and management of the Tate's collections. Iko Yokoyama is lead curator of design and architecture at Empress, Hong Kong's new museum for visual culture at West Kowloon Cultural District. Before joining Empress, she was based in Stockholm and served as head of exhibitions at Konstfack University College of Art, Crafts and Design. As an independent curator and writer, Yokoyama has worked on international exhibitions and projects, which include The Fab Mind, Hints of the Future in a Shifting World at 21_21 Design Site, Tokyo, and regularly has contributed to periodicals such as Form, Casa Brutus, Access, Pen, Studio Voice, among others. In 2008, she co-founded Editions in Craft, a production platform that encourages collaborations among artists, designers, and craftspeople, and worked on the project mainly in South Africa and Sweden. Welcome to this panel. I'm going to provide a short prefatory note right now, and it was very much based on the abstracts that were presented to me, and I found them extremely compelling, and that has led to this kind of mentation in a way. One of the things I was thinking about is the development of an evolving cross-disciplinary approach to collection initiatives, maneuvering sometimes a very subconscious terrain, in which practices kind of migrate space, discursive, methodological, and real, and hence are positioned through preservation to survive in history. So much of what I have read about your institutions brings to the fore the notion of hybrid media practices, and that need to keep evolving so as to survive within institutions as well. The much debated edicts, therefore, within current arts and institutional dialogue about how objects themselves construct meaning are through them expanding well beyond the ethos of the gallery, expanding the museum's mandate to include more public space and visual culture-oriented initiatives in order to encapsulate perhaps what we can think of as quotidian forms of non-conformity. These non-conforming objects and practices, as it were, push us to deliberate on how we preserve, as Boone mentioned, the ephemeral, the moment, not only the object. How do you, in fact, archive an experience? How do we situate through archiving and decenter through our conceptual stand at the very same time? I've often thought about Alan Sekula and his notion of the shadow archive, wherein the social truths we unearth through our work, those facets of community culture where we kind of go beyond capturing, catalog, and monitoring realities to facing each other's needs and creating a common ground. What else is the space of the museum but to create common ground? I recently chaired a seminar by this title, and one of the questions that we arrived at is, how do we come to an elision or a unity of personal politics and their social mandates? How do these find institutional or anti-establishment outlays through which we can unite our creative strategies? Especially in a world in which images, whether they are performed, static, or moving, become operators, sometimes very privileged operators, and we must think about that. All institutions, including the museum, then work within their own hierarchies, but do they have the opportunity to convert or surmount this through display, through making visible and reconstituting known legacies? I think a lot of us are engaged when we think about artist estates is to think about how to reconstitute them with time. The very rise, therefore, of institutional and extra-institutional forums for production and reception foregrounds, once again, some crucial questions about values that are accorded to cultural establishments in an expanded contemporary mediascape. And for this, once again, we question how to capture transformation, how to capture a tipping point in a practice. And I take a quote now, and I'll tell you who it is in a while. The old questions of traditional analysis are being replaced by questions of another type. Attention has been turned away from fast unities like periods or centuries to the phenomena of rupture, of discontinuity, of interruptions, whose status and nature vary considerably. Acts and thresholds that are suspended to the contentious accumulation of knowledge and force it to enter a new time, away from the search for silent beginnings and the never-ending tracing back to original precursors, towards the search for a new type of rationality and its various effects, an interplay of transmissions, resumptions, disappearances, repetitions. So much of what we deal with in museums in India, if not the subcontinent, are colonial objects that have already undergone a thorough objectification. At one time, even a post-colonial time, they were diminished, negated, subjected, manipulated beyond conscious and beyond compensation. And while the more traditional imagination of these objects did lead to an exponential growth of a certain knowledge, the systematic archiving and exhibiting of other material for the last decade, and actually well beyond that, has helped to reimagine the portrait of our geopolitical status right now. And hence, how do we ask, can archiving practices, and indeed preservatory means, highlight the politics of an institution, any institution as it continues to showcase cultures through its objects and creates representational modes, always creating modes of visibility, making visible. But what remains elided? Does pedagogy, in fact, come with collection and hence preservation, and do these precede practice, or do they come after practice? The field that I'm involved in, which is namely photography, and we know only too well today how alternative facts are generated through image-making practices, also allowed me to think about what those industrial arts exhibitions from the 19th century do today to our practice. How do they embed themselves in it? But as those institutions were kind of involved in aesthetics, questions of taste, there were other artists who were generating interesting modes of reception through their own homes, through their own studios, salon experiences and all. Nadar always comes to mind because he did so in 1874. Would those become important moments for extra-institutional forays for the arrival of a private space? And how do state institutions collaborate with them today is a question that has been asked. Is the mandate of a distributed and interlinked collection that lies outside any one institution more important? Museums of exiled objects. When we think about migrations, we think about what people travel with, aligning themselves through very distributed networks. And so in its national and international settings today, displays continue to raise a very broad and unresolved question of how and what to depict. How do the fraught subtexts of authority, allegiance, subjectivity, belonging, nationality, race, citizenship, come to bear on what we may preserve, and even how we may receive them with the passage of time. Are we receptive enough? This panel is therefore, in a way, a topos, can be a topos of reflection, through which concepts of identity, authenticity, and maybe something even more civilizational, where we are right now, can be addressed. But as much as the arts practices embed themselves in our ethics of documentation, perhaps we can consider to an extent the place of preservation as also autonomous, emancipated, and imbued with a kind of symbolic energy, an embodied dissonance that will not be subdued, but to an extent can be self-defining. If a self-generating legacy can be created, and I think we have to think about this while we encounter spaces of artificial intelligence and digital cultures, what exactly is the digital canon doing to our spaces is something we can think about. So the brief exercise today is perhaps to think about anchor points in our practices and whether unpredictable arcs begin to form when we record and when we document. And while we think about how media practices generally offer themselves in multiple formats upon multiple axes that enable dialogues and transfers, perhaps we may also imagine those convergences, that which cannot be saved, will live on through another kind of transference, not only through objects, but the absorption of ideas. So with that, I thank you all for your patience and your time, and the speakers as well. And in the very order that we have created, please come up and give your presentations, following which we'll have a brief discussion. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Mariles Gustilo, and I'm Senior Director of Ayala Museum. First, let me tell you about Ayala Museum. We are far in the Far East. You're in the country of the Philippines, and we've been around for quite a while. Ayala Museum is a private art and history museum established in 1967. It exists under the auspices of Ayala Foundation, which is the social development arm of Ayala Corporation, the Philippines' oldest business conglomerate at 185 years old this year. In keeping with the Foundation's vision of communities where people are productive, creative, self-reliant, and proud to be Filipino, the museum's role is to nurture active advocates of Philippine art and culture through the compelling engagements with our collections and programs to hopefully evoke a deeper understanding of what is uniquely Filipino. We are located in the central business district of Makati City, next to a mall with over 500,000 people passing by daily, with shops, cinemas, and restaurants as our closest competitor for their attention. A microcosm, if you will, of the state of museum-going in the Philippines. And yes, we charge an entrance fee. In June 2019, we closed for renovation, and we will reopen next year, maybe December 31. Our collections include Philippine pre-colonial gold objects from the 10th to the 13th century, which we had the privilege to exhibit in Asia Society Museum in New York in 2015. Chinese and Southeast Asian tradeware ceramics found in the Philippines that date back to the 9th century. Indigenous Philippine textiles from various cultural communities in northern and southern Philippines, various archeological and ethnographic objects, numismatics. We also have a fine art collection of works by the pioneers of Philippine art, Juan Luna, Fernando Amorsolo, and Fernando Sobel. In 2017, we participated in the 57th Venice Biennale as a collateral event with an exhibition on Sobel. Recently, we received a generous donation of the winning entries from 1951 to 2018 of the prestigious Shell Art Awards, from which many of our national artists have emerged. We also manage the extensive fine arts collection of the Bank of the Philippine Islands. Plus, we have 60 dioramas created in 1977 that capture key events in Philippine history, which to this day continue to be a ready reference about our history for students as well as artists. We also have a an exhibition on the evolution of Philippine costumes as well as maritime vessels. In particular, the collections of archeological gold, tradeware vessels, and indigenous textiles showcase a rich and complex society prior to 3 centuries of Spanish rule. For many of you who don't know, we were under Spanish rule for 3 centuries and under the Americans for 50 years. So many people say that's why the Filipino is a bit dysfunctional, because it's 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood. The gold collection reveals a complex and sophisticated pre-Hispanic civilization with an elite class who adorned themselves with ornaments embellished with intricate patterns of minute gold granulations and twisted gold filigree and implements with repoussé designs. The tradeware ceramics, which range from lustrous celadon to vibrant blue and white vessels and dishes and iron-spotted ware, tell of the Philippines as an entrepot even back then. While the textile collection of indigenous garments and accessories manifests our creativity as a people with a wide variety of weaves, patterns, and colors. These collections are kept at an external storage space, cataloged digitally, and made accessible to the public through exhibitions, education, loan exchanges, research, and publications. We extend the life and longevity of these objects in 2 ways. We keep it safe and secure through preventive conservation. Our collections and conservation team, led by Senior Curator Candice Guerra, constantly monitor relative humidity, temperature, ultraviolet, and lux levels, all pretty straightforward. Of course, the secret is finding the right combination by thoroughly understanding the materiality of the objects and matching it with desirable environmental conditions. This practice is applied to all the museum objects we transport, exhibit, and store. As a result, fortunately, knock on wood, so far, the need for actual restoration has been limited. And when necessary, it is done in-house and in consultation with local experts. Depending on the magnitude or gravity of damage, restoration is done within the museum premises to avoid unnecessary complications brought about by handling, packing, and transporting the object. On another level, while sustaining our primary mission of collecting, conserving, research, and exhibition, we keep our museum objects fresh and meaningful with what I call new expressivities or new entry points of fascination to our collections. We do this through a dynamic program which includes 14 exhibitions a year, workshops and lectures, concerts and performances. Firm believers in the digital revolution, we began our own digital journey 4 years ago by establishing first a more approachable personality online through our social media properties. Soon, the integration of digital technology was integrated into our operations with the development of the Ayala Museum app. We contemporized the fuddy-duddy dioramas with the use of virtual reality to tell the backstory of defining moments in history, such as the execution of our national hero Jose Rizal and the trial of Andres Bonifacio, who led the revolution against Spain. And recently, we launched the Ayala Museum YouTube channel, featuring specially produced videos to enable a closer look at and provide fresh perspectives about our collections. Let me play for you a trailer that we prepared. With the museum undergoing renovation, we sustained the trajectory off-site and online with a brand called Ayala Museum on the Go. It's really an exercise that consolidates and shares our contents and programs with a broader audience. Here's a short video about what we've done so far. We started in June. We also explore new curatorial models. In our last exhibition before we closed, Gold in Our Veins by artist-curator Mark Lewis Lim Higgins, we did what we had never done before. We allowed select objects from our permanent gold, ceramics, and textiles collections to be displayed in ways other than its institutional context. I must say it was a bit disconcerting for our curatorial team to have to move these objects from the 4th floor of our museum to the 1st floor. I had to remind them that some of these objects we had loaned to Asia Society in New York, to Musée du Quai Branly in France, and still, they were still a little concerned. But I think in the long run, it turned out to be a very educational experience for all of us. We also elevated the exhibition into a multisensory experience by going beyond the white cube. Here's Mark Higgins to tell you more about what we did.
Hi, my name is Mark Lewis Lim Higgins, and welcome to Gold in Our Veins. Gold in Our Veins tells the story of a reimagined antiquity through a series of portraits inspired by the ancient histories of Indochina, the East Indies, and the Philippine archipelago. Exhibited alongside these works are 24 objects that I selected from the Ayala Museum collections. They demonstrate how artifacts contain a dimension that goes beyond their historical or cultural significance. This exhibition was designed to resemble the warehouse of a wealthy Chinese merchant somewhere in Southeast Asia in the early decades of the 1900s. The concept of a warehouse serves as a metaphor for an unknown or secret room filled with opulent treasures that are a celebration of our history and our ancestry.
Overall, the results have been encouraging. In just 3 months, our presence in the malls have allowed over 350,000 people the opportunity to interface with the museum. While our growing fan base online of 100,000 is growing respectably and by any measure is the best way to connect with the youth. The 40,000 people who came to see Gold in Our Veins in just 4 months was record-breaking for us, and the positive feedback emboldening. I particularly like the note written by a young student in our guest book. He said, "I came back today to see this exhibition. I can keep on coming back, and I know I'll keep on learning something each time." Which is the point, really. There is a lot of anxious talk these days about the redefinition of museums, which is understandable. Change does that. As you can surmise by now, Ayala Museum's approach to change is iterative, experimenting, and might I say, flirting with change. But what we've learned in the process is at the heart of what we do as an art and history museum is and always will be the objects in our collections. Material evidence of the human condition, these primary sources must be kept safe and secure. But I posit that what will make these objects invaluable and timeless is our ability to fascinate generations with the wellspring of stories they tell, that only research and insight will yield, delivered on-site, off-site, or online, through narratives that will open minds, provoke curiosity, and move people, leaving them wanting more. For as our keynote speaker said in an interview 3 years ago, people who come to a museum, especially those who aren't regular museum goers, need to be transformed. They need to have an emotion. Thank you.
So thank you so much to the Asia Society for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm delighted to be here. So as a schoolgirl, I was very lucky to have been taught art history by a Dadaist activist. He ignored the curriculum entirely and instead taught us about modern and contemporary architecture, philosophy, and political history. And one of our cherished textbooks was Kenneth Frampton's Modern Architecture, A Critical History. Now, at the front of this very cherished book, in place of a dedication, Frampton quotes from Walter Benjamin's Thesis on the Philosophy of History And I'm sure many of you will know this quote, but I hope it'll remain a pleasure to hear it again. So here is what Walter Benjamin saw in this painting. A clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It's got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. So this description is of a painting which Walter Benjamin owned, and which, having fled the Nazis in 1933, he was momentarily parted from. He said of this parting, "The angel resembles all from I had to part, persons and above all things." So this panel asks us to consider the power of collecting as a tool of preservation. In a sense, this goes to the heart of the purpose of the museum project and why we might choose to collect. I was trained as a conservator. I have collection care in my job title. So for me, the desire to care for things that artists create, which may disrupt or comfort, that speak to what it is to live in our fragile world, motivates me to care for collections. I hope starting with a story about how an artwork came to represent a vision of history for one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, as well as encapsulating for Benjamin what is left behind when fleeing persecution, makes sense for this panel. The painting survives. It's now in the Israel Museum, having briefly been taken care of by some other illustrious caretakers, George Bataille and Adorno, the great critic of museums. So Benjamin's angel looks back at the mounting debris whilst being propelled forward. However, I think conservation actually looks the other way, always imagining the future of a work or a collection whilst holding the past and navigating the present. So if we see the museum as a tool to bear witness to these endeavours by artists and allow us that point of reflection, then we need to be able to serve the art of our time. So a significant part of Tate's current collecting strategy is focused on redressing gaps in our collection of artists whose work has been marginalised and overlooked. And supported by the Hyundai Transnational Research Centre, it's also working to disrupt the Western-centric telling of art history. The thing that has driven my work over the past 25 years has been marginalised art practices that at different times, have challenged the museum and have been considered uncollectible. In recent years, this has included live works, internet art, and activist art. I'm lucky enough to work for an institution that is up for figuring out how we make space for these works to flourish in the museum. So seeing how the museum might adapt and serve the art of our time is the driver for a current Andrew W. Mellon-funded project, Reshaping the Collectible When Artworks Live in the Museum. This project considers works which challenge the museum, artworks that unfold over time, that question the boundaries between the artwork, the archive, and the record, and which present dependencies on things outside the museum's control, either technological dependencies or dependencies on particular social networks or communities of practice. The challenge of many of these works is not to lock them down, but to understand what can stay the same and what might change, what might need to live in the museum for these works to flourish. So, this is a picture of a group of people gathered in a room at Tate, Liverpool last May. And here's a circle of people with one thing in common. Through their different forms of practice, they all are actively engaged in the care of an artwork. It's an experimental sound and film installation called 10 Years Alive on the Infinite Plane by Tony Conrad. In the center are the transmitters of the work that was first performed in 1972, and with them a group of local musicians who've just played the work live for the first time. So gathered around them are conservators, curators, registrars, technicians, and a couple of academic observers. 10 Years Alive on the Infinite Plane has just been performed working only from a dossier of information that drew on the knowledge of the work's transmitters that in their very different ways continue to support 10 Years Alive on the Infinite Plane and the artist's legacy. So Tony Conrad died about 3 years ago now. So the conversation that followed the performance examined what had been conveyed and what had been lost in the transmission of this work, with the exchange focusing on the embedded know-how of those assembled. I'm just going to show you a little sneak preview of a film we made, and unfortunately we've only got time for about 3 minutes, but I'll show you a little bit if I can make this work.
He's unframeable. That's the great point. I mean, you cannot frame someone who didn't want to be framed at all. Tony Conrad is an unclassifiable artist. He was a groundbreaking filmmaker and musician. He was a great pedagogue. Beyond this, he was a committed cultural activist.
One of the very first concerts that I produced at the Kitchen was with Tony Conrad to play the world premiere of what has become 10 Years on the Infinite Plane.
It's an expanded cinema performance composed of 4 different projections of black and white stripes that slowly move to the center and then form a square.
Alongside those projections, we have 3 instruments. So there's the long string drone, which is an instrument that Tony Conrad invented. We have a bass guitar and we have a violin, and they basically are responding to the soundtrack of Tony Conrad playing. And when he was alive, he would have played the violin himself.
The whole produces an experience based on length that engages with our feeling of memory and engages with the idea of what does it mean to see a shape changing and becoming literally alive. 10 Years Alive on an Infinite Plane embodies the contradictory history of the museum already in its title. Conserving doesn't mean looking back ever. It always means looking ahead. And keeping a work alive in the way that 10 Years Alive on Infinite Plane requires is the most challenging but also exciting experience for a conservator and a curator in a museum.
The work really is held by a network of people. But of course, when a work comes into a museum collection, we're thinking far in the future where that network won't be there to support a work. How do we plan to think about a longer legacy for a work like this?
What we want to do is to create the conditions for new possibilities to emerge that are still within the spirit of Tony Conrad and within the spirit of his work. And the transmitters are a key part of that process, as well as the new generation of performers.
Tony is no longer there, but he was aware of the fact that he wouldn't have been around. So he made his best to create a condition for the work to be transmitted. He didn't give any specific instruction because this was actually his attitude. He didn't want to teach vertically. He didn't want to be authoritarian. The beauty of 10 years alive on an infinite plane is against structures, against forms of power, and it's wonderful to celebrate Tony Conrad in that way.
Sorry, I'm going to stop it there. So after all the preparation, the readying of equipment and prints, the assembling of spaces, people, the testing, the shipping, the building, the unpacking, the tuning of instruments, the checking and the documenting, the performing of all these practices demonstrated the close attention to the specificity of the human and non-human materials that make up this work. Whilst the week culminated in a public performance, what had also been performed was conservation as a social activity involving people and things which extend beyond the museum, and also conservation and its associated practices as practices of care. Care is as much about what we neglect as what we care for. It is, of course, a power relation and political. Caring builds value, and not caring signals what we consider worthless. Our practices shape the object of our care, as well as produce knowledge that is uniquely rooted in that object's specificity. Framing our work as care encourages us to present the work we do differently, seeing it as a distributed network and challenging the neutral voice of the institution. And I love that comment of, that labels are written by God, we heard earlier, to assert the individual contributions to the care and the legacy of the work. Conservation as a license to care connects us to central ethical considerations about representation and collecting, authority, power, and agency. So the process of learning this work by Tony Conrad, and creating the means to see it enter a collection relied on a distributed network of people that I like to think reflects the artist's spirit and disrupts the authority of the museum in a rather beautiful way. So thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Iko Yokoyama. I'm a lead curator of the design architecture from Empress Museum. It's a new museum we are building, and then since already I got a lot of questions, so I maybe just get it done. We are planned to open end of next year to early 21, end of 2020 to early 21. Anyway, so it's because it's a new museum, also people wonder what we are doing. So, of course, I'm going to talk about the collection, but it's briefly what Empress is and what we are. And then here in the slide you see, so Empress is a part of, it's called the West Kowloon Culture District Authority. So as you see, it's a quite big piece of reclaimed land, which we are building the center with many culture facilities. And then so Empress is one of the major facility in the district, where we already opened a couple of theaters and smaller gallery spaces. And then as of today, the picture of the building is maybe almost 2 months old or so. So we already, the exterior is finished. It's a watertight building. And then we are starting the interior. And then the building is designed by Herzog de Meuron, the Swiss architects. And then, so this is a very brief view about our collection. So the Empress Collection is the 3 parts. Empress Collection, which includes visual art, moving image, and design and architecture, about 4,800 items. And then Empress Sig Collection, which is a kind of focus on the contemporary Chinese art. It's the generous donation by Dr. Uri Sig. And then Empress Collection Archive. That's mainly about the architecture-related materials. It's a process materials, the drawings and the ephemeras, photographies, correspondence, and brochures, and so forth. And So here, so that's the kind of how we're looking at what the Empress collect. We are not nationalistic. We collect only Hong Kong or China, not so. So from a vantage point in one of the world's most dynamic region, Empress will document the past, inform the present, and contribute to the future of visual culture within an ever more interconnected global landscape. The museum will take an interdisciplinary approach that both challenges and respect existing borders, while creating the meeting point for diversity of perspective, narratives, and audiences. So as you see here in the map, so we're just using Hong Kong as the vantage point to revisit the 21st century art, design, architecture history. So we are not rewriting a history or so, just changing the perspective we're looking at. So our collection is the 21st century focus, but it's a lot like the post-war. So but Asia has been many post-independence, post-colonial. So it's kind of roughly 1950s upwards. And then also because we have teams, but we are not the departments to, so the divided. So we have only one acquisition committees, and in a secretary team, we actively try to talk each other. So this is visual art and design architecture and moving image 3 team, but we rather seeking for those overlaps. What does it mean? And here's a very quick, the types of the collection. So we are kind of very, probably maybe looks a bit eclectic, but we believe these overlaps, and then actually the always design and architecture has been happening the same time and shaping our world. So it is relevant to looking at those kind of the relations. And then also the collection is building very transnational approach, and then also it's very narrative driven. So I will give you a few examples. It's often almost like a detective or like the story. So it's one research and leads to the next, and then leads to the next. So it's kind of that's how we're building the collections. So this is one example. It's a Hong Kong the architecture. So we call it like a new start. So it's the whole world kind of the experience to devastations, and then to restart their own, to gaining their own new identities, and then to building the financial and then the social reconstruction. For the Hong Kong case was like in 1930s and 60s was the massive migration from mainland China and tiny little islands and the small part of the Hong Kong land. So of course the housing was a big issue. So as you visit in Hong Kong, you see massive, like a very big apartment complex that also really rapidly needed the social to build the infrastructures and housing. But still, the same time, the Hong Kong built this as also, the financial centers from the foreign architects. So those are happening at the same time. So the Hong Kong has created kind of very interesting image, while very local kind of the developments, and then also very the high-tech building at the same time, which also how we read through these stories to the Hong Kong image of Hong Kong start to live by its own. So today, the Hong Kong is one of the most popular city depicted in the video games and in the movies, like the Sino-futurism and so forth, like Ghost in the Shell and Blade Runners. So many of those makers, they never even been to Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is as kind of living in another space. So those will inform. We are starting looking into, are we going to collect any video games or the kind of movie-related material. So that's also the little bit example how very social, historical, the architecture project, but it's also to our current visual culture today. So we cover a lot. So because they're doing conference in India, so I brought the one here examples. It's the South and Southeast Asia efforts. So the first, maybe on the left, is Jeffrey Bauer, the Sri Lankan architect. But it's also not just we are always looking at the people's network with these artists and architects, how they have been influenced, and because it's not the influence not come from their own country or tradition. It has been how the Asia has been transnational, influencing from here and also from elsewhere. So the Jeffrey, we also collected the Ine de Silva, was the batik artist who worked very close collaboration with Jeffrey. And then here's a very little example of India. So of course the collecting architecture, the challenge is because we can't collect it with architecture. So through, of course, archival material, pictures, but this photography is also the evidence. So the Madame Mahathas, that's also, we can see the building, but it's also another one was the house of the Fab Indias. I think it's the founder. So the life, how it has been depicted, also the I've said, like because how these furnitures and then the style of the living has been shaping the culture. So we are very happy. We actually found the mini bogas, one of the old taru chair. That's also it's also not how we read this taru chair is not just as India's most the very unique design history, but it's also same time in Japan. For example, Tendo Moko was a plywood manufacturer, so which also they're around the same time to try to distribute the good design, affordable price to every home. So there was kind of parallels to what's been going on around the same time in different regions. That's how we're looking at. Here's another, the Sumet Jimsayan is a Thai architect. Also the reason we can't go to be a specialist of each country. So we are not building the collection. This is the section of India, Japan, or Thailand. But then how you choose them. So that's also driven by the kind of the networks and narratives. So Sumet is an American trained architect. But our story goes to he and then also the Malaysian architect Lim Chok Kit. So they have been the last 10 years of Buckminster Fuller when he passed away. So 10 years he was very involved in Bali. So he was doing a lot of workshop in Indonesia. So then those two young architects was kind of hosting them. So this is their dialogue about Buckminster Fuller and the Southeast Asia. That's also informed because we want to expand that story. But it's also Sumet has designed this so-called Roboto building, still exists in Bangkok, which also appears to the contemporary artists, the Nabin and the Rilke Trabanias. They have been the famous exhibition, Cities on the Move. They made a comic, and this Roboto building appear as a hero. And then also during this Bakis, the workshop, there's a local painter who made the Baki dome in bamboo. So he depicted the painting and so forth. We did a very big, large archive. It was it's almost about 20,000 items, which we don't know yet how many actually it is. It's hundreds of crates has arrived to Hong Kong. That will take, so we will invite the future researchers and to unpack, to read, to utilize this collection. But as we acquired almost the entire archive of the archigram, but the why and then how we're going to use it is also to put it at the archigram in the dialogue. So the archigram, it's also and then Hong Kong is one of the close to the kind of very imaginary cities, and then experimental city, and then those are very highly relevant to this part of the world, which is still building massively, and then this kind of, which wasn't maybe able to build, but this kind of imaginary architecture, what's actually make a new relevance to our current world today in terms of technology, ecology, but it's also a fantasy as well, and then it's also connected to the past, like a Bucky Fuller, to the future. Another challenge collecting architecture is, so we did the one category, which also made the Empress one famous was on the right on your side. It's a Shiro Kuramata, is a Japanese, the famous architect's entire sushi bar. So we have acquired one sushi bar, 1-to-1 scale. So why we did this kind of insane acquisition was because of this figure. Kuramata was already highly respected, the designer from internationally, but his practice only known by furnitures. But Kuramata's starting point as an interior architect. But it also interior architect is like also, the architect's legacy very often, sometimes it remains in the building, but interior architects who are doing the commercial spaces, it's never going to, it's disappear all the time. But there is no hierarchy. Commercial spaces, that's very much what our everyday life. So the Kuramatas, there was only one kind of intact, the interior design left, so that's the reason motivate us to acquire. And then another building fragment, it's almost like a shard. If you the piece of ceramic, how imagine it's this kind of, it's little piece of tactile material, give you such a fantasy imagination, even broken, you can't see the whole pot, maybe a little piece of shard can make you imagination. So that the architecture fragment is also another way also to make it also a little bit audience more accessible. The exhibiting architecture is often very challenging because it's the drawings and the correspondence, it's maybe not so audience friendly, but this kind of the building fragments also the way to reach out to the audience. Here is also manufacture innovations. We've been it's a lot of in Asia has been almost everyone familiar with rice cooker, this kind of import-export manufacture, how we're shaping our everyday life. So one example is this, took the three-wheelers, because the Daihatsu midget, but here, this is everyone you're familiar. So the Daihatsu exported the midget in 1961 to Pakistan. So that was the first export to South Asia. So then it's become the vehicle of the entire, so it has really changed the mobility. So that's also the story we share. And then one also, just to fresh not we are collecting only historical objects, so we also collect the contemporary, also addressing our kind of intangible and digital cultures, and then also this kind of contemporary manufacture culture, what we made a consequence environmentally. So it's not only just a legacy of how amazing innovation was, but also the damage made to our living today as well. So this kind of the contemporary design also very well taking care of the very critical messaging and approach to address our past. Here is another attempt to how to collect. It's Hong Kong is also everybody who has been. Let me see the neon sign, but which is the disappearing craft or engineering because of in terms of the environment. Now everything is getting to LED. So we did the project to collecting physically, the lower on the right, the drawing, the sketches, and physical neon signs. So we have some of that. But we made a video documentation, but it's also up in the middle was an audience participatory, because which neon sign do you remember? So we made a existing neon map. So it was online those days. Everyone can kind of put on the map, but that's also maybe in 20 years, it will be interesting to document how many of these will still there. It probably will be very few, but that's also the way. So we also invite the audience to help to map this out, and we also made the bus tour to see the neon sign. And then the last is also because it's for us, as an audience, it's very important, and then we also try to give different multiple entries to our collection, but this is also because we are the museum not open yet as well. So it's very recently we opened our collection, but it's very just a fragment of a collection. So there's a different way to search, but why not? You can maybe search by color. So then suddenly maybe you see some, maybe curators, we never do the exhibition with a pink, but it's also the way the audience can play around, but not showing this slide, but we also open our API. So it's who does the coding, so they can kind of work with our collection. So the last research it's about the time. So it's also Pip said that we see the museum as the museum collection as the tools. So it's very important. It's come in and out. So I think it's the new institution. Because we're a new institute, we can do this for the already 20th century museum collected. So we can kind of include the more narratives and the materials to the collections, which make also future researchers to have a more multiple interpretations. Thank you.
Thank you for those extremely diverse and expansive sort of initiatives across the board, really. I'm trying to get my mind around it at this very moment, but I have made some notes. It seems so much through the practices of either archiving, managing a museum, and creating a space for a museum that one is kind of consciously theorizing the possibility of a museum expanding its functions, more and more expanding its functions. And there are various narrative trajectories that come into play within this context of what one might call aesthetic pluralism at this point of time. One of the things that strikes me most distinctly is this constant reference to design and architecture. So I thought the best way to tackle this is through the idea of place responsiveness, dealing with the local context in a way in order to expand ideas about the larger picture that the museum is trying to project with the passage of time. Mariles, I was really interested, and I'll kind of go through my questions at one go, because we're also running short of time. I was thinking about, as you talked about the museum flirting with change, I think you use that as a point of engagement, but it's also such a museum that is rooted in the culture and history of the Philippines. Now, in having to do that, one is also trying to, in your museum, create a fora for it where it is universally readable. So I wanted to ask you a little more about how that culture of the Philippines is being brought to this transnational sphere. What are the challenges of doing that? Because it has various local, I guess, resonances and intonations. So one of the questions I had, which was for you. Pip, if I may, I wanted to sort of talk to you or just ask you a little bit more about the Transmitters series. I mean, this is really a compelling, meditative, social, experimental kind of a space that is being created. Now, one of the things that stuck out to me is what are, in these spaces, the ethical parameters of encountering that space? Because one of the things you mentioned was the institution as a neutral space. And at the same time, you mentioned the interest in absorbing a kind of activism within that space. And I think these things have to be talked about or teased out a little more within the context, because certainly here, where I come from, or where we come from to a great extent, perhaps museums are not so much of a neutral space. They are embedded with different kinds of hierarchies and different kinds of also, modes of exchange and I guess the creation of a certain critical discourse. They are distinct. And in what they volunteer, in what they sort of foretell, they also create dissonances and challenges and divergences. So where is this neutral space of the museum going to be able to absorb a kind of activism through a social experimental process is something I was very curious to ask you about. And with Ikko, I have to say, my mind is still trying to contend with the content that you have shown to a great extent, because it is a museum of everything. It is a museum that goes across the board, and the only sort of metaphor I can find for it is the World Wide Web. And of course, deludes to an extent a rhizometric pattern that is emerging out of any one given moment, and then going to capture the things around it to a great extent. In creating this museum of what I will now call of everything, I wanted to ask you what that does to a curatorial mandate, because it seems to be a new curatorial ground that can be broken with a museum such as yours in the future. Have you thought about that mandate to an extent for a forthcoming curator to take on this role? And what would that be? Just, your ideas around it. So maybe we can go around and take it from there.
If I understood your question correctly, because we are so rooted to being Filipino, and yet, how do you elevate it into a transnational?
What might the challenges be of doing that?
It's not as challenging as I thought it would be. I think it's got to do with what being a Filipino is, because we have been colonized, and we have a strong pre-colonial history. That all sort of sums up in a story that is sort of unique to us but familiar to others, because there's something about our history in these three phases that in that sense I feel is transnational rather than just local. We used to be very apologetic that our culture was not pure. But I think the hybridity of our culture allows us to handle that in a museum like Ayala and the kind of collection that we have. I think that's how we address that. It's not the easiest thing to do, but with that framework, it allows us to develop publications, exhibitions that sort of begin to build that story rather than deny it. Because I can tell you, it was a hang-up for many generations that we weren't as pure as the Japanese or as pure as the Thai. But that was the deck of cards that we were dealt. We were under foreign rule, and the way we appropriated it is what makes it, I think, unique.
May I ask you to say a little more about the ongoing exhibition of costume that you have? Because it resonates very nicely with another exhibition on here at the National Museum.
Actually, the decision to bring out the exhibition of costumes was just because it would be safe to bring it out, because it was, it's carvings. But what made that interesting was we decided to bring it out because there's also something going on in the Philippines, wherein there's a need to look back, and we felt that was something that was very easy to do, and yet allow a discussion to happen. And because we were in so many malls, for every 2 weeks we were moving around, then people were saying, "Oh, why don't you bring it here too?" And then that started the discussion, especially among students, because the other thing was our educational system has been changed so that art and history is just 30 minutes a week or something. So museums have become an alternate way to make that discussion happen. So we're just very lucky. All those malls that you saw, that's the sister company of the Ayala Museum, owns a lot of malls. So they were very responsive when I asked if we could do this, take it to travel around. Okay.
Well, thank you. I mean, it resonates so closely also with the Bhaudajilat Museum's collection of dioramas and objects, and it's a great connection, I think, between the two institutions. Pip.
So, thank you. Thank you for your reflections on what I said. I think, actually, I'm not saying the museum is a neutral space, and in a way, for me, what the project with Conrad was about is some quite small but very significant shifts that have been translated in very practical ways into beginning to trouble this idea of the neutral voice, particularly in our documentation. So, very, tangible example that the standard documentation that goes out is this unauthored museum voice written by God. And so what we've done actually with acknowledging the importance of the community around Conrad is ensure that what goes into the documentation is a recognition of all the different contributions and that they are authored by, because actually the authority of those different memories is completely rooted in who those people are. So it makes no sense on any level to remove that. So, I think also the reason I'm very interested in some of the thinking around care is it comes from this feminist ethical position, which is very much about acknowledging a sort of situatedness, which I think, again, going back to our keynote, we can't acknowledge the different perspectives unless we begin to acknowledge the situated and the framing nature of all of our perspectives, right? And I think also we're in a very particular moment at Tate where I think that the museum really, it's so important for us to reflect upon the big issues of our time. So I think we all have to kind of stay with these issues around decolonizing our narratives, thinking about what kind of issues that we are going to bring in to discuss within the museum. And so, it's just we are in that moment where museums are increasingly taking on these roles, which are quite different from, I think, the kind of the more neutral role that we've taken in the past. And, you mentioned art education, which was probably our first big campaigning issue, but I think we're seeing those expand. Yeah.
I think what also struck me about your presentation, and maybe this is another way to think as we were talking earlier about artist legacies, is that sometimes when you create these experiments and sometimes when you engage in a kind of community imperative, which it seems to be to a great extent, one also realizes that maybe artistic or artist estates and thoughts and identities don't necessarily need to be rooted to places of origin anymore, but rooted to subjects which they deal with through their work, which creates an interesting arc as to how we actually identify with them with the passage of time, no longer needing to deal with questions only of nationality or boundaries, but transgressing that to a great extent. So thank you for that. And especially for me, it creates an idea for thinking about the museum as a great space for metaphor. Not just something that is rooted to one kind of identity and one kind of sort of refraction, but really just multiple at all times. Ikko, please.
Yeah, I mean, we totally agree, because it's also, I said in the beginning, because we are a new museum, so we have learned from, there's already multiple examples, so therefore how we can respond to make a new institution 21st century. And a question about kind of the curator's role. So yes, it's very traditional in one way, and then also very demanding, because it's already, it's not like everyone is very, of course everyone has a very own scholarships and then the deep knowledge in a subject, but we are forced to learn about the other subjects, because it's about the ink art or the visual art. So you can't get avoided. So because we force you, every curator, because we are at the same time and we are looking at the same history, and we are so it's almost like a very new kind of the school, which we are very fortunate. And then also, so then it really shows the kind of type of curators we have. They are who are interested. Maybe if we want to be very deep dive to the one subject, that's also probably never have the time. But that also can be our frustration as well. Sometimes are we too super, the shallow, have no time to really go deep dive. But it's also typically what we can is because of the network. So because I'm not an India specialist, so I work with the specialists here, and then also that's the way, because we don't have to do all this curatorial research alone. So it is very much kind of, because it's a collegial, then we want to be a little bit the catalyst to kind of connect all this knowledge, and then everyone has a special knowledge, and then this accumulation we hope can be the place to be a catalyst. That's how we kind of see it. Yeah.
No, thank you. It also, one of the things I take away from that is that if there was a revisionist counter-structure to a collection mandate, it's really coming out so beautifully through your collections. And I think as we are all talking about preservation as well, we are also at this point of time thinking about how to go on beyond traditional documentary roles that the museum has played in order to create a new mode of what will exist with the passage of time. And I think there is nothing more that might create a kind of interesting new image discourse with the passage of time, a discourse of all kinds, where we're not just thinking about visuals, but image, and image manifesting in all sensorial ways and forms. So I think with that, we will conclude our session. Thank you very, very much for your time. Please give them a warm hand. And thank you. Thank you very much.